Welcome to Feminist Founders, a podcast that explores how to create a more equitable world through entrepreneurship with your hosts, Becky Mollenkamp and Faith Clarke. Welcome back. Hopefully you listened to the episode earlier this week. If you haven't, you can go back and listen to understand the context in which this conversation is happening. But this month, we're talking about the Feminist Founders framework. And last episode, we talked a little bit about how that came to be and high level about what it is. And today we're zooming in on the first piece of the 5 elements of the framework. And that first piece is vision. And what we have sort of like just the little nugget of that is that I understand my personal vision for a better world and my vision for the way my business functions to cultivate this world. I intentionally tend to this vision and use it to shape my vision for every part of how my business works. And I think maybe the most important thing to start with is, why do we start at vision? And I know for me, values, which I think relates very much with vision, are almost always where I start, because I think we need to know our why, like what actually matters most to us. What are the sort of non-negotiables of running a business and living life? And I think the vision piece is also part of that why, of like, what am I trying to get to? What's the point of all of this? Why am I doing this work? Where am I trying to get to? And so I think that's a really important place to start. And I'm assuming, because I think we landed on this one real easily. Like, we both agreed this is the place to start. Why is it important for you that you start with your clients at vision?
Yeah, because people tend to come to us with problems. There's no solving a problem without knowing where we're going. And often when, we've been to doctors or whoever who tries to give us their path solution to a problem, not being connected to who we are and where we're going, and it just feels off, like you just don't know me, right? So there's something about stepping back in every interaction and saying, what am I creating? And every interaction, because I think stuff is going to happen and stuff is going to feel hard, like we were saying before. And when things feel hard, you have to be like, what am I creating? Where am I going with this? What are my priorities? And the vision is the thing that anchors you. So for me, I need the grounding deep into the earth almost. I need to feel like I'm really heavy and settled. And vision helps me. The more I nurture that, it's like, why am I doing this again? Okay. All right. So what does that mean in terms of what I should do now? Mm-hmm. And building that practice. Why am I doing this? What does that mean about now? Just to keep that, keep ourselves focused in terms of where we're going. And like we were saying the last time, some of the things that we're envisioning, we haven't seen before. And so it's very easy for those things to become like, stick figures in our minds. It's not without deliberate tending. It's just like, because the models in front of the things that are 3D in front of us aren't that.
Yeah, it's funny. I think Jordan Maney, who we both know and love, said something along the lines of like, you can't try to create something you've never seen before, right? You can, but it's hard. You don't know what it is unless you can name what it is that you're trying to create, because you're trying to build a world that hasn't existed. And it's funny, you mentioned anchoring yourself into the ground. And I think of this slightly different, which is like, where am I headed? So I'm thinking about movement, because I think of it as like a compass or a map. And I don't think that we need to know at the early stage of any project, business moment, the exact route. Some people do. I understand that. For some people, that's the safety and security they need. They need to know exact route, left, right, whatever, where are we going? But I think we need to at least have an idea of where we headed. I'm in St. Louis. I could easily go north and end up in Canada, go south and end up in Mexico. I can go east and end up in, anywhere on the East Coast. I could go west, like I'm right in the middle of the US and I could go anywhere. And if I don't have a plan, if I don't have a why, if I don't know where I'm headed, I need to at least identify, hey, I'm heading to like Florida, although I don't want to go there, but so like I at least need to know that, because if I don't know that, then I can end up in California and then wonder, why am I so far from Florida? Because I didn't even know where I was headed. And I've done that before in life. Without that vision, without that why, you end up somewhere and say, how in the hell did I get here? This doesn't even feel good. This isn't right. And it's because
Right.
I didn't identify first that no, I meant to be going to Florida and I ended up over here. And then I think the other pieces that we'll talk about later can start to get more of the, okay, where now are we going to go along I-80? Are we going to take 70? Then you start to get a little more specific about your route. But I think you at least need the destination. And in my mind, that's kind of what some of this vision is about, is what's the destination? And I like for you that it feels like, what am I grounded into? And for me, it's kind of like, where am I headed to? So whichever way feels right for you, the whole point is figuring out that piece of the real fundamental why.
Yeah, and I think like for me, because I'm such a head person, I can be off in my head and not, it's almost like I'm too flexible. Like that's where I'm going. And then I'm kind of, and the wind takes me here and there and we course correct. And so something heavy underneath will trim down all the possibilities I see. I can see 1,000 possibilities. We're headed to Canada. We could go 15 different paths. I'm on a path and then I'm on this, and it's like, but wait. There's something even more fundamental. I'm going to Canada, and part of my vision for going to Canada is to go a particular way, is to feel a particular thing as I'm going. I do not want to be seasick. Is there a sea way to get to Canada? I don't know.
The
Good
Mississippi,
job,
maybe?
Chris.
You're taking the river up.
Right? So there's a way that I need pruning of
Mm-hmm.
the options so that I can kind of be steady. And
Mm,
so it's that kind of tension that the vision can, wait, what am I doing?
yeah.
Right. That means
I love
these
that
50
because it's
options.
like planning a road trip with your family, and you may all agree you're going to Florida, but there's also that additional piece of, as we get in the car, like, how do we want to feel on this trip? Right? Because we get to make a choice. We can choose to be miserable because we're stuck in a car for 2 days, or we could make this an adventure, or we could make this fun and silly. We could make this a learning opportunity.
Bonding are we
Right.
bonding, and are we going to have good
Right.
conversation, or are we going to be on devices? It's
Right.
like,
Are
right.
we going to use this as a time to learn about our surroundings and whatever? There's so many different ways you could approach that same trip. So I love what you're saying, that added context of like, I want to think about how I feel on this journey as well. And that's the piece that I want to keep remaining focused on, because speaking of going back to our last episode, disruption, which will show up at every part of this. I do think when the disruption comes up, one of the key things that can help with that, we'll get to it more later, but is being grounded back in the why. And like, wait a minute, this is a challenge. I wasn't expecting it, but I had committed that I wanted this process to be fun, or I wanted this process to be like in community and collective with others and engaging, whatever it looks like for you. How do I return to that to work and navigate through this disruption? Right. Because
Right.
again, when it comes to the disruption, I could choose to be like stopped by it, or I could say, hey, wait a minute, how do I approach this in a way that like brings my curiosity to it, or the collective to it, or the fun to it, whatever the values and vision were. So, all right. I love it. That's the why for vision. Now let's talk a little bit about what it is. We're trying to keep these episodes short for you too, so that they're not, because we could talk forever about these things, but
This is
there's like pulled out sort of 4 key points, and we thought maybe we could talk a little bit about how we think about them, and that might help for the listeners to think about how you can think about these inside your business. So even if you've already thought about values, even if you've already thought about kind of your bigger vision, your bigger why, I think it's always helpful to revisit, because it can evolve just like you do. So let this serve as an anchor point for you of like, let me revisit this for myself. And the first piece is, I know my feminist priorities and how they impact what I want to see in business generally. So when you hear that, Faith, what does that mean to you? That your feminist priorities and how they impact what you want to see in business generally? Like, what does that mean to you and to your business?
Yeah, I think, we can have a whole range of them. So I think it's important to just anchor into what's core for you. For me, my own values around deep listening, my own values around certain kinds of connections with people, like a nourishing connection, supportive connection. My own values around integrating difference and making whatever we create be something that reflects the integration of difference, whatever the differences are in the people that I'm working with. Those values, when I picture what the world what does my business need to look like? What would the world look like if people had these nourishing connections? And then what does my business need to look like? Having that super clear then helps me now answer the questions. How do I build, like, what does this partnership with Becky need to look like and feel like for me? So when I think of knowing my priorities, it's not just the internal kind of, I want to make money. I want to hit certain goals at a certain point. But I want to feel a certain way, be a certain way in alignment with equity, justice, inclusion. And for me, for Faith, nourishing a certain kind of connection with people is a part of how I do that. So then I'm asking myself, when I'm recruiting clients, how am I recruiting them in a way that centers that Faith is about deep connection? And when I am thinking about my, like independent contractors helping me with some social media stuff, how do I do that in a way that centers my belief about deep connection? Because the moment I have an independent contractor as an example, and I treat them like a commodity. I'm handing you this thing, you're going to hand me that thing, and the relationship is purely transactional. I have stepped away from my connections with people need to be nourishing and deep. So then I'm like, how do I make that make sense in the context of my life so that I'm not out of alignment with this vision that I have? So that's what I mean when I say knowing my priorities, knowing it, and then starting to ask the question, what does it mean to show for me that nourishing connection is a priority in my content? So people can tell in my writing, for example, or when they hear me in interviews, even if they wouldn't call it connections or relationships, they can hear the quality of it in how I sound and how I'm answering questions, because it's top of mind for me that I'm not transactional. I'm not transactional. One of my values is about the both and, that how I integrate difference is about the yes, yes. So then if somebody asks me a yes, no question, guaranteed they're not going to get an answer in when they're interviewing me, because I'm going to kind of make it into the both and. So it's, I don't know that I'm answering your question really, but this
Well,
is how
I
I
mean,
think.
I think it's okay. It's for people to hear the thought process behind these things. And I think you may have gone even farther into the layers that we're going to talk about, because you're sort of taking that like general view and how you're applying it, which is part of where we're going to go to, which is fine for people to see it, how that thought process works. When I think about my feminist priorities, I think for me, the big things that come up in my mind are curiosity, compassion, and collective action. I think are sort of that's for me, my value set. And when I think about how those values impact what I want to see in business, for me, it means I want to see more folks with marginalized identities working collectively to support each other, but also to work together to make their offers even more robust, to serve even more people, to have a bigger impact, to make more money. I think we need more money in the hands of folks with more marginalized identities to support each other so that we aren't in our silos isolated. And then partly then that looks like I want to help to be creating that. I also want to see more compassion, right? A less assumption, less anger. I could do better at modeling that in many ways, but inside of business, I do try to do that. And curiosity as a coach, I'm always asking questions, but I also want to bring that just generally. I want people to like learn about each other. And I think some of what we're trying to do with creating community space addresses those things. So when I think about business as a whole, like I think I see a vision of a world where business functions in a way that is honoring those values, that is more compassionate. It's putting people first, profit
Right.
second, putting planet first and profit second, that is thinking about what does it look like to care for the collective instead of only focused on the individual. What does it look like to ask first instead of assume about others? Like if those, in my mind anyway, if those three value set were like applied in business would look remarkably different. And I think you feel the same way about like the values that you're bringing. If they were applied into the business world, business would look very different. Like
Yeah.
Amazon couldn't exist with my value set.
I think that there's one of my values that kind of like really drives me is this whole need for like communal connection and communal support. Like to be that this whole the individual creates what they need in their lives is so false. And we pretend that that's really what happens. And so for businesses to live communally, like inside the workplace, for people who work there to be communal. And therefore, it's not on every individual worker's shoulders to perform, but the recognition that the performance is really a collective expression. And so meeting people's needs for whatever it is that we need in our lives it's done communally. It's not like I have to make sure that I can make enough money to satisfy me and my family's needs. And for me, then it's about how do I think about my business to make that possible? How do I live that out in the small community I have here? Me and the one independent contractor. What does that mean for me and one other person? What does it mean for me and two people if I want to create that in the world? So, yeah.
Yeah, because then I think when we talked about this vision section, it's kind of going from like this macro to the micro. And so sort of thinking about your personal value set, your personal vision, like what is the business, what do you see for the possibility of what's out there for feminist business? Like what could it look like? And then bringing that down, then when you kind of have that vision of then what is that, how does that connect to your big picture for your business, right? So not just business as a whole, but your business. And I think you talked a little bit about that and I have as well. It's like we want to create more spaces where at a smaller level, this vision that we have is starting to actually show up in practice, right? So what we see through Feminist Founders is like our goal of bringing business owners together who share this kind of vision and saying, okay, the world around us hasn't changed yet. It hasn't caught up. But what does it look like for us to model it with our businesses? How do we work together more collectively? How do we get curious about each other? How do we bring compassion? How do we, care for one another, the things that we've talked about? And then we go down even more into more of the micro, which is creating a vision for how every area in your business is in alignment with that. And that's where you started to talk about, like, if I bring on a contractor, what does that look like?
Right.
And so I think when you think about what's the big picture, and then kind of how am I doing it in the way I'm serving my clients and the way my business shows up in the world, then it's like even down lower inside of your business, the part no one else sees. And that to me is where it can get much more challenging in a way, right? Because one, nobody sees it. Nobody has to know, right? So that's where it's like with my son who's learning about integrity. What's integrity look like? Are you able to walk it even when nobody has to know whether you are or not, right? And also though, I think some of the choices can become more messy because maybe you're using Amazon and like that doesn't fit with your big macro vision, but maybe at that's like smaller level, maybe there isn't a great alternative because maybe you have a disability or you have children and too much to manage and you just don't have time, or the other prices are too expensive and it would represent an inability for you to have your business, right? So there's the conflict that can happen, I think, sometimes at those more micro level. One is like nobody knows, and two is maybe there isn't a way for me to execute my values in a way that makes sense. And then having to do some of that recognition of the systems that make it impossible or difficult or too challenging or not workable right now, and being able to forgive yourself a bit too, to say, I can have this bigger vision and I may not execute it perfectly all the time myself. And that's okay. I don't know what you think about when I share that, but like, that's what kind of comes up for me.
Well, I think about, as I've talked about this a bit, that one of the elements of white supremacy is perfectionism. Right? No one is executing anything perfectly. We for sure know that supremacist patriarchal systems are not executing perfectly either. They're actually making quite a mess. And so part of my feminist ideal is to be to center the process of it. To center the intention of it. Yes, I know intention isn't impact, and we're constantly doing this work of repair, but it's okay. We're in this process and like really committed to this ideal. So when I think about the micro, I think, how do I live out my values in this way, given the context I'm in? And so, whether it's Amazon as an example, I might be living out in my own social media or in my own kind of office supplies stuff part of what I'm living out is the prioritizing of my rest and the prioritizing of everybody's rest that is involved in my business right now. And if that means that I need to get the stuff here versus driving to wherever, there's always a way to center the vision that we have within the context that we're in and who we are as people, and there's a way that we can kind of get, perfectionist is an overused word, but like we have this whole long list of the ideals mean this. And I think, no, the ideal means what it means to you, this person in this body, and to these people who are actually on your, team, client base, whatever. And then the question is, how do we live that out? We, us in this moment, 2025, March 24, and to be open to the fact that how I can live it next week could be different. And so it's the holding of the ideal, but knowing that the implementation will vary according to how life varies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also sometimes, because like you said, there's a whole list of things and they don't all have to be done at once and they don't all have to be done perfectly, quote unquote. And so it might be that right now you're prioritizing equitable pay, and that just to make that happen is enough of an endeavor that you can forgive yourself on some of the other things until those become the focus area. And I think the last piece of this, like as we continue to go more and more micro, is the last one that you identified, these, just to be fair, so I don't want to say we, but these 4 key points. The last one being, I can define one practice that I can work on to strengthen the integration of my big picture vision into the various areas of my business. And so that's that idea of like, what's the one thing? Because I think too often what ends up, especially I will speak for people with more privileged identities, because there's this like feeling when you understand and want to do better and are like, I want to dismantle these things. I don't want to be a part of these systems, but the systems continue. But there's this like, especially at the beginning of the journey of like unlearning all this, there's this compulsion almost to be like, I want to get it all right because it's all been wrong and you feel bad. There's all that guilt stuff, right? So it's like, I got to get it all right now. But that can end up holding us back because it's impossible to get it all right. We still live inside of these systems. There's no escaping them. So it will never be perfect. It can't be because we're trying to do what we can inside of imperfect systems. And so if you're waiting for everything to be until you can do it all, so you can run the model business, till you can be the model white person, guess what? You'll never do it. And that's what keeps us out of action. And that's often what I think holds people up who get on the sort of wrong side of that, where they'll be like, well, if I can't get it right, why bother? Right? When they get called out or called in once and then they just see like, well, I tried, so why bother? But that's the whole point, is it's a little bit at a time. It's figuring out what you can do. And so I love the idea of like each day or each week in your business, just thinking, okay, what's the one thing this week or today that I'm going to try to do that will help to strengthen this vision, right? Even if it's small, even if it's the smallest thing, right? It's like, today I have more capacity, so I will go to the local mom and pop shop to buy that thing, right? Or today, again, like going to what you said, I'm going to give myself the luxury, not the luxury, the right of some extra rest. Mm-hmm. Or I'm going to tell my VA, you know what? There's no deadline. This isn't essential. That project I gave you could really be done whenever. So you figure it out, right? Like you get it when it works for you. Take more rest if you need to. So I love that idea of just like the one thing and exploring that, because it brings this really big, heavy top of the pyramid goal down into something where it's like, okay, I can't do all that today, but what I can do today is X, Y, or Z. So I love that piece, Faith, that you included.
I think that for me, when I think about the one practice, it's about centering myself in the vision. As a person with multiple marginalized identities, and I am asking, I cannot create this vision for everyone. So through the lens of even one of my marginalized identities, what's the way to move the needle forward so that I could actually have a chance of living out this vision, this preferred future, that I could be in that preferred future? What's that one thing that I can do that shifts the needle for me? And regardless of who we are, I think we all have marginalized identities. And if we can access them and access our relationship to the barriers in our society that get in the way. So even, let's use, patriarchy. And Bell Hooks said that for patriarchy to harm everyone, it needed to harm the men first. So even if you hold a privileged identity, there is harm that you have lived, and destruction that has come through the lens of that privileged identity. And as you become aware and kind of turn the needle on that, that can give you access to what's one practice that will turn the needle for this thing, in the world around me. And is that about noticing where I am masking so that I can hold my space? In which case, my practice may be to, regardless of the interaction, regardless of client, staff, whoever, I'm going to, one, as much as possible, be vulnerable. And two, I'm going to encourage and honor people's vulnerability. And three, I'm going to notice when I start to want to judge people when they are being vulnerable and kind of tend to that, because that's a judgment, is really a judgment against myself. So it's like, it could just be that, like, oh, I realize that I do this thing because of, where I am in this whole system, and to be in the vision I want, vulnerability is a piece that's needed. And I'm going to have that practice and be present with the consequences of it and how it feels, And so whatever it is, how do you put yourself in the vision? And then what's your one practice to kind of create that vision for yourself?
And I love that we bring two different perspectives. Like, I think that's part of what I love about this partnership and what it means for Feminist Founders, because obviously I hold marginalized identities, multiple marginalized identities. I also will always have one privileged identity that sort of sits above those just by the color of my skin, which is the reality of the world we live in. And I think that it's important for me, while I love what you said, and I think I want to also think about me inside of that. I do think the more privileged identities you hold, the more important I think it is also then to think, almost instead of one practice, two practices each day, which is one of like, how can I tend to myself? How can I apply these things to myself? But I also think, just as the person with, the white privilege in the room, I feel like I need to say, like, I also think it's important to think about, how can I use that privilege today? Like, what's one micro small thing I can do today to use that privilege to help begin to create the change I want to see in the world? And I think that's, I think anyway, it's important for the more overlapping privilege identities you have, to be thinking about that.
And one way that I invite my friends to use their privilege is to take the risk of being in their marginalized identity. Because the thing is that for me, when I take the risk, which I do all the time, I allow myself to be at risk of loss of resourcing and reputation. And, I wrote a pretty vulnerable piece recently on my Substack, and it was scary because I feel the weight of, whoa, if people don't like me, it's going to cost me more. And yeah, I do it because it's part of mission and stuff for me. I think that the more privileged identities you have, part of this practice is to, through the lens of a marginalized identity, there are people who hold that marginalized identity who also hold other marginalized identities, and therefore can't even speak out through the lens of that identity because it's going to cost them rent, and so you can center something that's tender to you at much less loss. And I think that's the way, because otherwise, when our multiply privileged friends just try to use their privilege to help others, that runs quite close to saviorism. And so it's the really anchoring yourself in the, how do I let myself be vulnerable, knowing that it's going to cost me less than it's going to cost my friends with these multiple overlapping.
That's interesting, because that's me, in my mind, that feels like using your privilege the right way. Because you have the privilege, like my privilege affords me that I can be more vulnerable at less cost, which is why I do that. I suppose when I but that's interesting because I think it is reframing for me a bit of what I just said, because I don't really mean how can I use my privilege to help others in that saviorism way. I mean more of like, how do I use my privilege, I suppose, with myself, but to create the change I want to see in the world, right? Because yes, white saviorism doesn't help anything, but the idea that like I can be more vulnerable where others can't. I can be more outspoken where others can't. And for me to use that privilege in that way helps all of us, right? By me using my voice where someone else that would be represent a much greater risk, then I'm going to do that. And so I think about that. Like for me, that's often what I'm thinking about when I am public about certain things. I think this is the space that I need to use that privilege that I have because I'm white to be able to use my voice in a way that others, it would represent a far greater risk that for them to do that. And I think the only thing I was thinking is leaning too much. I have found can happen with white women when we lean too much into our marginalized identity as a woman. For some folks, that can end up looking like holding that as if it means that I have the same understanding or same experience as someone who holds more marginalized identities, right? Like, oh, but we're all marginalized here, rather than still really owning and understanding the privilege that comes with my white skin and how that does make my experience as a woman different from your experience as a Black woman. That just fundamentally are two different experiences. And so that's the only reason that I was saying, like, I think that we as white women have to, or white people, maybe we have white men listening. That's a whole other journey. But I think that we do have to acknowledge the privilege component and just be careful about only leaning into the marginalized component, because I see that happen so often. And I find that that often goes against the goal of what we're trying to accomplish. Does that make sense?
We all have a ton of work to do to kind of
Yes.
really,
How about
right?
that?
We all have a ton of work. And I would just say that a white woman, as an example, can call out unpaid labor for women in the workplace right now, even if that white woman, gets reprimanded or loses her job, it's going to cost less than the Black woman who's calling it out. And so I think that part of this whole revolution is about that you do have yes, it's not the same. And, there is whatever the thing is, I consider myself to be neurovariant or neurodistinct, that my brain is different. But it's not the same as my kid with autism or my kid with autism, ADHD. And so I have the privilege of being able to narrate it and not be penalized in the ways that they are penalized. And so
Exactly.
I lean into it, and I allow that, I allow myself to speak on it, knowing fully well that I'm not talking about their experience, but I can put some light in it in ways that they can't, so.
Well, and we've gone long just because this is, there's so much nuance. And I think that to me is actually really important, because that's part of what this is about, right? Having about what we want to put out in the world, which is having community spaces, having places with other people who are engaged in the same conversation, who are holding that same bigger vision. Even if our visions are slightly different, we're all trying to get to a place, right, that has a similar feeling. We all know we're headed to Florida or to Canada or wherever we're at, right? And maybe you're going to Ottawa and I'm going to Toronto, but we're heading in the same direction. So let's work together. And that's what we're trying to create with Feminist Founders. So if you're not a subscriber, subscribe. If you're not a paid subscriber, upgrade. Our paid subscribers get to join us every month for conversations like this in community, where we talk about components of this framework, how it applies to your business, these kind of nuanced discussions that come up. And that stuff is really beautiful. And that is, I think, us putting our vision into action, and why we want to share the vision with everyone. So if this kind of conversation gets you excited, make sure you subscribe. Consider upgrading to a paid subscription so you can find other folks, find your community of people who are heading the same direction as you, and you can learn from, engage with, have really interesting discussions with, get some of that help on crafting your vision from the outside. And then at the end of this series, we're going to talk to you about an even deeper way to work with us, but we'll save that for later. So next time you hear from us, we'll be talking about leadership. So anything you want to leave us with, Faith, on vision before we go?
No, I think you need to draw it, get a nice sketch pad and just Or make it visual. I'm not, vision boardy, but just like see it like a movie. That's the place that we want to get to, where we can just kind of play it in our minds like a reel.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Oh, and then make it into a reel and let's share it with the world if you're ready for that. All right. Well, we'll be back next week to talk about leadership. So tune in. Thanks for listening to Feminist Founders Podcast. If you'd like to learn more or support our work, please visit feministfounders.co. The link is in the show notes. There you can become a paid supporter for as little as the price of a cup of coffee. Thanks again, and we can't wait to welcome you back for our next episode.